discipline, it doesn't usually break when you quit. It breaks 2 seconds before that. In that tiny gap where you start negotiating. I'll do it later. Just this once. I'm too tired. I'll start tomorrow. That gap is where the old version of you, it takes over. And once you learn how to win that gap, discipline gets a lot simpler. I call it the 2 second gap. It's the space between the moment you know what you should do and the moment you either do it or you talk yourself out of it. That is where discipline lives. Not in the big speech, not in the perfect plan, not in the motivational reset. In that tiny moment where your body wants comfort and your identity has to make a decision. Picture a door. On one side is the version of you who decided last night, the one that said, tomorrow I'm getting up at 5 a.m. On the other side is comfort, the bed, the snooze button, the scrolling. The door only stays open for 2 seconds. And it's in those 2 seconds your brain is going to try to close it. Not by force, but by conversation. Just 5 more minutes. I'll go harder tomorrow. One day won't hurt. But here's the thing about the door. If you move through it before those 2 seconds are up, the door closes behind you and you're committed. You can't negotiate your way back through a closed door. But if you hesitate, if you spend those 2 seconds thinking about it, the door slowly closes. And you're back on the comfort side, right where you started. That's the 2 second gap. It's the space where the door is still open. And those that seem more disciplined, they're not stronger, they're not more motivated, they're just faster through the door. Because most people do not lose discipline all at once. They lose it in a sentence. I'll do it later. They lose it in a compromise. Just this once. They lose it in a delay. I will start tomorrow. And the dangerous part is that it feels harmless, but it's not harmless. Because every time you negotiate with yourself, you are training your brain that your word is flexible. You said you'd get up, but then you negotiated. You said you'd work out, but then you negotiated. You said you'd stop the scrolling, but then you negotiated. And here's the part that stings the most. The problem is not that you changed your mind. The problem is that your weaker self learned it could talk you out of your own standards. That's why negotiation is so dangerous. It doesn't feel like quitting. It feels like reasoning. It feels like being realistic. It feels like you're giving yourself grace. But a lot of what people call grace is really just permission to stay the same. And if you're honest, you know exactly what I mean. You have had moments where you knew what to do. You were not confused. You were not unclear. You didn't need another podcast. You didn't need another plan. You knew, but then you paused. And in that pause, the door started closing. And if you don't move before it shuts, the rest of the day gets decided for you. Because the first negotiation is rarely the last one. You hit snooze once, then you skip the workout, then you scroll longer than you planned, then you say the day is already ruined, then you promise, I'll restart tomorrow. And then one tiny negotiation turned into an entire pattern. But here is what most people miss. You do not beat negotiation by arguing harder. You beat it by removing the argument. Because the moment you start debating with yourself, you've already made discipline harder. Should I get up? Should I work out? Should I start now? Should I wait? Should I check my phone first? That is the trap. Questions create options. Options create delay. Delay creates negotiation. And negotiation breaks discipline. So the fix is not to become better at arguing with yourself. The fix is to stop letting your weaker self enter the conversation. That means you decide before the gap ever happens. Not in the morning when you're tired, not when your cravings hit, not when your phone is in your hand, before. The night before, the hour before, the moment before temptation has leverage. This is called a pre-decision. And a pre-decision is where you remove the choice. In other words, you don't wake up and ask, should I get out of bed? You wake up and move. You don't ask, should I work on my goal? You start the 20-minute timer. You don't ask, should I check my phone? You put it in another room. Because the more you rely on in-the-moment decisions, the more power you give to your weakest emotional state. And that is where most people are losing. They're trying to make disciplined decisions while they're tired, tempted, distracted, and emotional. That is a terrible strategy. You do not need more motivation in the moment. You need fewer decisions in the moment. And this is where discipline becomes practical. Tonight, pick the one promise you are trying to keep. Then write the exact action you will take when the door opens. Not vague, specific. If the alarm goes off, feet hit the floor. If I want to scroll, the phone goes across the room. If I feel like skipping, I do 10 minutes anyway. If I start making excuses, I count down from 5 and move. Because once the action is already decided, the door doesn't get a chance to close. You walk straight through it. Here's the challenge. For the next 7 days, stop trying to win the whole day. Win the first 2 seconds. When the alarm goes off, move. When the excuses show up, move. When the old version of you starts talking, move. Don't debate, don't explain, don't negotiate. Just move. Because the longer you wait, the louder the excuse gets. But the faster you move, the weaker the excuse becomes. That is how you rebuild discipline. Not by becoming superhuman, but by refusing to let the old version of you lead the conversation. So tomorrow morning, when that 2-second gap opens, when that door begins to crack open just long enough for you to walk through, remember this: that is not a small moment. That is the moment. The promise or the excuse. The future you say you want or the comfort you keep choosing. Win the gap. Walk through the door. Because the life you want is usually on the other side of the first 2 seconds. Now, that gap doesn't close in one video. It closes in reps. Take the next one. I'll see you in the next video.